izquierda del auditorio y en las columnas del fondo, poniendo especial atención en las indicaciones de la Brigada de Seguridad.
A la primera, déjame ver. Sí.
Muy buenos días. El Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género les da la más cordial bienvenida al 25º Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género, la investigación feminista hoy, perspectivas, innovaciones y desafíos. Nos acompaña en el presidium el doctor Alberto Vital Díaz, coordinador de Humanidades. La doctora Ana Gabriela Buquet Corleto, directora del Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género. La maestra María de la Paz López Barajas, directora general de Autonomía y Empoderamiento para la Igualdad Sustantiva del INMujeres. La señora Teresa Guerra Favela, asociada de programas ONU Mujeres México. Y el doctor Moisés Vaca Paniagua, secretario académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de la UNAM. Para dar inicio a este acto, tiene la palabra la doctora Ana Buquet, directora del Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género.
Gracias. Muy buenos días. Les doy la más cordial bienvenida al 25º Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género del CIEG, un espacio para la discusión teórica y metodológica sobre temas de relevancia actual en el campo de los estudios de género que organizamos cada año desde hace un cuarto de siglo. En esta ocasión hemos dedicado el coloquio al análisis, discusión y difusión de los aportes, las innovaciones y los retos de la investigación feminista en su quehacer interdisciplinario en diferentes áreas del conocimiento, con el fin de comprender la relevancia que tiene el abordaje feminista en los procesos de investigación. El feminismo es un pensamiento que aún hoy en día produce resistencias y oposiciones de toda índole y sobre el cual se han creado múltiples imaginarios sociales que combaten activamente sus fundamentos científicos y filosóficos. Así ocurre con esta ola de carácter internacional y profundamente conservadora que se ha propuesto la tarea de destruir el campo de conocimiento al que denomina ideología de género, con el argumento de que esta amenaza a la familia y a la sociedad en su conjunto, con ideas que van en contra del orden natural de las cosas. Otro ejemplo reciente de los embates en contra del feminismo es el uso del concepto feminazi, para referirse a las mujeres, muchas de ellas jóvenes, que luchan por sus derechos. Sin duda, estas reacciones responden a las grandes transformaciones que el feminismo y los estudios de género han producido en pro de sociedades más justas e igualitarias y que ciertos grupos pretenden detener para conservar el statu quo. Por fuera del ámbito académico feminista es poca la gente que conoce y reconoce los avances teóricos, epistemológicos y metodológicos que esta corriente del pensamiento ha aportado a lo largo de varios siglos para la comprensión y visibilización de formaciones sociales milenarias, sumamente complejas, que producen múltiples modalidades de desigualdad, violencia e injusticia en contra de las mujeres y también de aquellas personas con identidades sexogenéricas que no corresponden con el modelo heteronormativo y por ello se vuelven, como diría Judith Butler, sujetos ininteligibles. El feminismo, a lo largo de su historia, se ha enfrentado a realidades sociales muy diversas y sin duda ha logrado transformaciones impensables en otras épocas. Sin embargo, siempre se enfrenta a nuevos retos ante los cambios vertiginosos que nuestras sociedades experimentan frente a la globalización, el neoliberalismo, las nuevas tecnologías, la agudización de las desigualdades y el recrudecimiento de las violencias. Por eso nos pareció muy importante hablar de la investigación feminista hoy. ¿Cuáles son sus perspectivas, sus posibilidades de innovación y sus desafíos? En la organización de este coloquio participaron el Instituto Nacional de las Mujeres, ONU Mujeres y el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de la UNAM, a quienes les agradecemos su apoyo y, por supuesto, su presencia en esta inauguración. También al doctor Vital, coordinador de Humanidades, que siempre nos acompaña muy de cerca en nuestros proyectos. De manera muy especial quiero agradecer a nuestra conferencista magistral, la doctora Anne Phillips, de la London School of Economics, que ha realizado un largo viaje para compartir con nosotras sus reflexiones más actuales sobre la teorización feminista y la pertinencia de continuar utilizando el concepto de igualdad de género. Y sin duda también quiero agradecer a la doctora Amneris Chaparro Martínez, que llevó a cabo la tarea de coordinar este coloquio. Muchas gracias.
Escuchemos a continuación a la maestra López Barajas, directora general de Autonomía y Empoderamiento para la Igualdad Sustantiva del INMujeres.
Muy buenos días tengan todas y todos. Pues un gusto estar aquí. Doctor Alberto Vital, coordinador de Humanidades, doctora Ana Buquet, señora Teresa Guerra, doctor Moisés Vaca, amigas, amigos todos. Pues estar aquí en este Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género es al mismo tiempo un privilegio y un gusto tener la posibilidad de escuchar avances en la investigación, reflexiones sobre la teoría feminista, sobre las perspectivas, las innovaciones y los desafíos que tenemos precisamente en la investigación. Conocer más y mejor el mundo de hombres y mujeres, la dicotomía que se devela como un espectro donde los seres humanos nos colocamos con nuestras identidades, orientaciones, roles, prácticas, actitudes, es sin duda algo que necesitamos, es algo que nuestra sociedad reclama y por supuesto es algo que no debe posponerse. Estamos frente a un cambio muy importante global en donde la participación de las mujeres en la vida pública se ha convertido, pues no solamente en un desafío para nosotras las mujeres, sino también para la sociedad en su conjunto. En los años 60, 70, decíamos que lo personal es político. Y como dice Rita Segato, pues cambiamos en lo personal, pero en lo político todavía tenemos mucho por hacer. Pero más allá de decir que lo personal es político, creo que un desafío enorme que nos planteamos en la investigación es sin duda que lo personal también es económico. Y creo que ahí los desafíos que tenemos en la investigación pues son muy amplios. Cuando hablamos de que lo personal cambió, está cambiando, aunque no hemos logrado todos los cambios que quisiéramos, sí tenemos una mayor educación en general, las mujeres, niveles educativos insospechados. Hoy en México tenemos una generación de jóvenes, mujeres, que no solamente tienen una menor deserción escolar, sino que tienen más logros educativos y más credenciales educativas. Nuestros derechos sexuales y reproductivos están en plena efervescencia y luchamos en lo cotidiano por precisamente avanzar en este sentido y trabajar mucho sobre nuestras libertades de decisión en todos los aspectos, pero particularmente frente a nuestros derechos sexuales y reproductivos. Participamos más en la vida política. Hoy, sin duda, el estar ya colocadas en la visibilidad política, creo que es un paso importantísimo, es cierto. Tenemos muchos desafíos porque estamos ocupando espacios, sillas, pero no necesariamente detentando el poder. Y en términos de nuestros desafíos en la participación en todos los ámbitos y los obstáculos que enfrentamos, pues esos parece que siguen todavía poco abordados. Me refiero concretamente a esos obstáculos que nos anclan en nuestros roles tradicionales, en nuestros quehaceres y obligaciones, en términos de lo económico, haciendo ese trabajo que sostiene a nuestras economías, ese trabajo que no se paga, ese trabajo invisible y que hoy día pues está cobrando relevancia en la investigación. No cambiamos del todo, estamos cambiando, tenemos muchos desafíos y esto es todo un reto en la investigación feminista. Es tan amplio el espectro de investigación, bueno, que de alguna manera se refleja en la agenda del coloquio en el que hoy estamos y pues los estudios tienden, sí, a diversificarse. Hablamos de teorías, hablamos de conceptos. ¿Qué tanto es útil un concepto u otro? Bueno, vamos a escuchar a nuestra ponente magistral en este sentido, pero también es importante estar conscientes de que todos estos conceptos y todos estos desarrollos feministas han hecho enormes aportaciones a todo aquello que desde hace ya varias conferencias mundiales nos propusimos para entrar en la política. Y ahí yo creo que es muy importante hablar no solamente de la política en términos electorales o en términos legislativos que nos permiten cambiar esa igualdad formal, sino qué hacer para cambiar la realidad de las mujeres en lo concreto, en lo cotidiano. Y ahí creo que tenemos un enorme desafío porque efectivamente quienes de alguna manera participamos en las políticas públicas, estamos obligadas a nutrirnos en lo cotidiano de la investigación académica, de esa reflexión necesaria, imprescindible para nuestro quehacer y que además nos permite también voltear los ojos a nuestra legislación, a todo lo que es la normatividad internacional y todos estos conceptos acuñados desde las convenciones y en particular pues me refiero a la convención a la CEDAW en concreto. Entonces, sí, efectivamente vamos avanzando y hay que volver a construirnos en ese andamiaje normativo, institucional, reflexionar sobre lo que hemos logrado y también mostrar en dónde nos hemos equivocado. Conocer más y mejor nuestras identidades, nuestras orientaciones, desarrollar y fortalecer la concienciación y la comprensión sobre la igualdad de género, el empoderamiento, nuestras libertades, nuestra autonomía, pues son desafíos sí académicos en la investigación, pero que esos desafíos pues no se agotan en la investigación teórica. Creo que un desafío importante para la academia sigue siendo el poder desarrollar investigaciones que muchas veces se miran con cierto recelo y que tienen que ver con las técnicas y las metodologías para hacer política pública. Yo creo que estos desafíos van desde la medición, no es gratuito, que en muchos países se haya dado una lucha frontal con quienes producen información, quienes producen estadísticas, para trastocar la forma en que miramos y medimos los fenómenos, en la forma en que miramos los aconteceres diarios de la vida cotidiana de hombres y mujeres. Es algo que tenemos que vincular más entre la teoría y lo que es ya la práctica de la política pública. Sin duda, es importante participar desde el poder político, pero también son importantes los análisis descriptivos, entender más dónde y cómo se producen esas discriminaciones, esos agravios, esas violaciones de los derechos humanos de las mujeres, teniendo también herramientas técnicas y metodológicas para ello. No es gratuito que la agenda del día de hoy tenga precisamente aspectos muy importantes que tienen que ver con la violencia contra las mujeres, el feminicidio, reflexiones que hoy sin duda nos colocan en un lugar distinto al que estábamos hace 20 años cuando las mujeres participábamos menos en la vida pública. Me parece que toda esta agenda que tenemos dibujada en el coloquio muestra los esfuerzos que se tienen en nuestro país de alguna manera, y aunque sea una pequeña muestra, de las reflexiones que tenemos que hacer desde la academia. Pero yo no quisiera terminar esta intervención sin señalar lo importante que es invertir en la investigación. Creo que ese es un enorme desafío y eso ojalá que se toque al final en la mesa de reflexión, porque la tendencia a siempre relegar la investigación feminista a un segundo plano, creo que es algo que es una lucha que tenemos que dar. Los recursos para la investigación feminista son muy magros, no tienen paralelo con otras formas de hacer investigación y creo que es algo que tenemos que demandar y exigir porque, como en otros campos, el estar relegadas siempre sin los recursos para hacerlo, creo que es muy importante. Tenemos que estar muy pendientes de qué va a pasar con los recursos que se dedican hoy a la investigación y en ciencias sociales, pero particularmente en los estudios feministas. Yo llamo la atención a esto y bueno, pues muchas gracias.
Escuchemos a continuación a la señora Teresa Guerra Favela, asociada de programa ONU Mujeres México.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, estimados integrantes del Presidium. Pues yo quiero transmitir un mensaje a nombre de nuestra representante en México, la señora Belén Sanz, quien desafortunadamente no pudo asistir por estar fuera de México, pero sí transmitirles el honor que es para ONU Mujeres poder hoy estar aquí y acompañar este 25º Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género, la investigación feminista hoy, perspectivas, innovaciones y desafíos. Quiero transmitir un amplio reconocimiento a la UNAM y en especial al Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género y a todas las personas e instituciones que han hecho posible que durante todos estos años, 25 años y de manera continua, pues se mantengan estos espacios que, como ya mencionó Paz, abonan a la comprensión de los fenómenos y a nuestro trabajo. Quisiera también hacer un reconocimiento desde ONU Mujeres a la UNAM por su compromiso en favor de la igualdad de género que se ha manifestado con la suma de esta institución y del rector a la campaña de ONU Mujeres He for She, con más de 20 compromisos que están cumpliendo, y otras iniciativas, muchas clave impulsadas por el CIEG, como el Observatorio Nacional para la Igualdad de Género en las instituciones de educación superior. Para ONU Mujeres ha sido muy importante poder aprender de la investigación feminista. En verdad agradecemos la generosidad con la que muchas mujeres pioneras nos comparten los conocimientos, nos comparten las reflexiones y nos permiten abonar a nuestro trabajo, que es impulsar políticas públicas que abonen al logro de la igualdad entre mujeres y hombres. Por ello, para ONU Mujeres es, y queremos aquí reafirmar el compromiso, será prioritario seguir manteniendo una alianza muy estrecha con la academia y con la UNAM de manera particular. Esta alianza nos permitirá seguir trabajando para impulsar una agenda de investigación sólida e innovadora en materia de igualdad de género y considerando los temas que ya mencionó Paz, ¿no? El trabajo doméstico y de cuidados que tanto impacta en las mujeres, la violencia y el feminicidio que urgen respuestas urgentes, la salud, la educación, la migración, por mencionar algunos temas. También creemos que esta alianza nos va a permitir seguir impulsando espacios institucionalizados donde jóvenes académicas y académicos puedan formarse en temas y seguir alzando la voz y reproduciendo las ideas. Genera reflexiones colectivas como este espacio para analizar desde distintas perspectivas los desafíos para el logro de sociedades más justas e igualitarias y para el diseño, que como ya mencioné, de políticas públicas que permitan el fortalecimiento, por un lado, de la sociedad civil, la rendición de cuentas y la transparencia. Como se plantea en la Agenda 2030 de Desarrollo Sostenible, si no se considera la igualdad de género como eje transversal, no podrá haber desarrollo en el mundo ni ser sostenible. El carácter universal de esta Agenda 2030 obliga a responder al compromiso de no dejar a nadie atrás y a considerar las desigualdades y la discriminación que padecen las personas más desfavorecidas. Como todas y todos sabemos, en todos los países del mundo las mujeres y las niñas experimentan múltiples desigualdades y formas de discriminación cruzadas, incluidas las basadas en su sexo, edad, clase social, capacidad, raza, origen étnico, orientación sexual, identidad de género y estatus migratorio, por mencionar algunas. En este sentido, la construcción de conocimiento nos obliga a ir un poco más allá, a generar mucha más y más robusta investigación científica de manera continua, datos estadísticos y construcción finalmente de conocimiento que nos haga ver a todas esas mujeres que se están quedando atrás. Para concluir, no es posible, y esto lo transmitimos, el total desarrollo de una comunidad académica si no se pone en el centro la igualdad de género. Nos congratulamos entonces de estar hoy aquí, de abonar a estas reflexiones. Muchas felicidades y enhorabuena. Esperamos que durante estos 2 días se generen pues muchas soluciones, muchas reflexiones y muchas propuestas innovadoras ante estos desafíos. Muchas gracias.
Escuchamos a continuación al doctor Moisés Vaca Paniagua, secretario académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de la UNAM.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Yo quiero agradecer a la doctora Ana Buquet y a Denise Chaparro por habernos invitado a colaborar en esta edición del coloquio. Para el doctor Pedro Estepanenko, director del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, para mí y para mis colegas investigadores, esta colaboración es muy importante y ojalá podamos mantenerla en futuros coloquios y en otras actividades para continuar fomentando el impulso del feminismo en la universidad, tanto en el ámbito práctico como el institucional y en particular en el teórico. Entonces, con respecto a la teoría, yo espero que podamos ir colaborando para fomentar diferentes acercamientos feministas en la universidad, con varias actividades más. Ojalá podamos volver a hablar de la posible cátedra feminista en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras y algunas otras cosas que podamos pensar, ¿no? Pues básicamente eso es lo que yo quiero decir. Muchas gracias.
Escuchemos a continuación al doctor Alberto Vital, coordinador de Humanidades.
Muchísimas gracias, muy buenos días. Yo pensé que Moisés iba a tardar un poquito más para terminar una nota. Muy buenos días, doctora Ana Buquet. Muy buenos días, María de la Paz López Barajas, de Mujeres. Muchas gracias por sus palabras. Teresa Guerra Favela, muy buenos días también, de ONU Mujeres. Quisiera comentarles que con Nuria Sanz la próxima semana tendremos los festejos por el Día Internacional de la Filosofía, que también es una actividad que con Nuria hemos estimulado muchísimo, y en ese contexto es de celebrarse que una de las mesas del coloquio sea precisamente diálogos filosóficos feministas. Saludo por supuesto a Moisés Vaca del Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, porque su parquedad al intervenir no es sinónimo de poca participación, al contrario, en realidad el Instituto ha trabajado muchísimo, y por supuesto es de felicitarse que hayan llegado ya a esta 25ª edición del coloquio porque habla de la enorme consistencia y continuidad del mismo. Saludar a las personas invitadas. En unos momentos más escucharemos la conferencia magistral, inaugural. Yo quiero quedarme también a escucharla, por lo tanto quiero que mi propia intervención sea breve. Pero sí quiero mencionar que recoger lo que acaba de decir Moisés de una cátedra, por ejemplo, son formas de organizar la investigación, los coloquios. El señor rector ha apoyado todas las reflexiones que ustedes han hecho y, entre otras cosas, apoyó intensamente la conversión del programa en centro y también él ha apoyado intensamente el hecho de que en este mismo piso 14 haya una ampliación del centro, quizá una visita a las instalaciones. Ana, puede ser una buena manera de ver cómo va creciendo, cómo se va expandiendo el centro, lo cual es muy, muy importante. Y escuchando también las reflexiones que hacían, me quedé pensando que el Museo de San Agustín, en el centro de la ciudad, que se tiene que inaugurar en menos de un año, va a tener un baño incluyente. Eso es muy, muy importante a raíz de una serie de reflexiones, de un video, de una serie de videos, de hecho 2 videos que pude ver y que nos ayudaron muchísimo en buena hora, en buen momento todavía, a hacer esas pequeñas aportaciones. En efecto, la maestra María de la Paz hablaba de políticas públicas, de pasar a las políticas públicas, y a veces en nuestros microcosmos podemos tener logros muy significativos también por todo lo que entraña la Universidad Nacional para el país. Y en este contexto, ¿por qué no hablar un momento, aunque sea brevemente, de las elecciones tanto en México como en Estados Unidos? Una de las cosas buenas de las que ya se pueden hablar, todavía hay incertidumbre en algunos resultados, hay certidumbres que no son muy halagadoras, pero hay una que sí es importantísima, es la creciente presencia de mujeres en responsabilidades del poder, tanto en Estados Unidos como en México. Eso me parece que es un signo importantísimo de los tiempos. Hay que aferrarse a las buenas noticias en todo momento, en momentos difíciles, y me parece que esta es una de ellas. Quiero decirles también a nuestras visitantes que por primera vez, el 1 de julio, una mujer fue electa como jefa de gobierno de la Ciudad de México, una de las ciudades más grandes del mundo, para un mandato completo. Y con un gabinete mayoritariamente de mujeres. Ella nos ha pedido 2 cosas, ella es una universitaria, nos ha pedido 2 cosas: 1, apoyo, y 2, soluciones muy concretas, muy bien pensadas, eso sí, reflexionadas, pero muy concretas. Tiene una responsabilidad inmensa y por supuesto que hay que darle todo el apoyo. Por primera vez una mujer será directora de CONACYT. La felicitábamos también porque ella va a agregar una de sus primeras decisiones, una decisión de la palabra, pero es una palabra importantísima porque va a agregar humanidades a la palabra, a las siglas CONACYT y al nombre CONACYT. Me parece que es muy importante. Hoy la saludé y vamos a tener una conversación más tarde. Y una tercera mujer, entre otras que se pueden mencionar, que va a tener una responsabilidad inmensísima, muy delicada, pero en buena hora y muy importante, la secretaria de la Función Pública en el nuevo gobierno, es otra universitaria, de hecho es una investigadora nuestra del subsistema de humanidades, y también la Función Pública va a ser una secretaría con una tarea importantísima por el mandato que le ha dado la sociedad al nuevo gobierno de atacar de frente la corrupción, entre otros temas. Corrupción, que es un cáncer que afecta muchísimas cosas, puede dañar políticas públicas muy bien pensadas, pero que no se llevan bien a cabo por problemas de corrupción. Entonces, Claudia Sheinbaum, Elena Álvarez Bulla y Irma Erendira Sandoval son las personas que he mencionado que tienen una tarea dificilísima frente en los próximos días. Entonces, en este contexto tan interesante, tan abigarrado, tan complejo, es muy importante que este coloquio toque temas centrales, temas que siempre van a ser muy importantes. Evidentemente hay que seguir trabajando en temas de mentalidades que no… que parece que cuesta mucho trabajo que cambien. En el mundo contemporáneo, yo hablaba ayer de las 3 paradojas de Donald Trump. La número 1 es un iletrado que provoca muchos libros, que provoca que escribamos muchas cosas, aunque él mismo es prácticamente iletrado. La segunda paradoja es que es un conservador que no conserva nada, que está destruyendo todo. Los pasos que damos con mucho trabajo, parece él empeñado en destruirlos. Por eso la nueva conformación de la Cámara de Representantes de Estados Unidos puede ser una esperanza para detener esa destrucción de este conservador que no conserva nada. Y la tercera paradoja es un hijo de migrantes, nieto de migrantes, que ataca a la mayor riqueza que puede tener el planeta, que es la riqueza de la vida, la riqueza de las personas antes que nada. Y en este contexto donde tantos hombres y mujeres, madres de familia, con niñas y niños caminan por nuestro país, pues es un contexto importantísimo en el que hay muchísimo que hacer. Dicho lo cual, y con una celebración por este coloquio, quiero decirles a ustedes que constantemente estoy presentando libros e inaugurando coloquios, y a veces al presentar libros termino siendo las tales y tales horas, pero en ese caso sí, como sí vamos a inaugurar un coloquio, entonces sí, les voy a pedir que nos pongamos de pie. Ahora sí corresponde decir que siendo las 10:33 de la mañana de este miércoles 7 de noviembre de 2018, para mí es un inmenso honor declarar inaugurados los trabajos del 25º Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género, la investigación feminista hoy, perspectivas, innovaciones, desafíos, no sin una felicitación a la doctora Ana Bouquet, a su equipo de trabajo y por supuesto a la doctora Chaparro. Muchísimas felicidades por todo su trabajo. Muchas felicidades.
Agradecemos la presencia de las autoridades. A continuación tendrá lugar la conferencia magistral Why Don't Gender Theories Talk More About Gender Equality? Con la doctora Ann Phillips.
Alguien dejó su teléfono. Buenos días a todas y todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta 25 edición del Coloquio Internacional de Estudios de Género.
Es para nosotras realmente un gusto que podamos compartir qué hay en la investigación feminista y qué mejor manera de iniciar estas reflexiones juntas y juntos que con la conferencia magistral que nos ofrece Anne Phillips. Vamos a proceder de la siguiente manera. A continuación voy a presentar a Anne, después ella va a hablar durante algunos minutos y después haré un comentario muy breve al respecto y abriremos la sesión para preguntas y comentarios del público. Anne Phillips es una de las figuras más importantes de la teoría política feminista contemporánea. Es profesora Graham Wallace de Ciencia Política en el Departamento de Gobierno de la London School of Economics. Llegó a LSE en 1999 como profesora de Teoría de Género y fue directora del Gender Institute hasta septiembre de 2004. Es miembro de la Academia Británica y de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales y cuenta con doctorados honorarios por las universidades de Aalborg en Dinamarca y de Bristol en el Reino Unido. En 1992, su libro En Gender and Democracy fue coganador del premio Victoria Schuck de la Asociación Americana de Ciencia Política como mejor libro sobre mujeres y política. En 2016 recibió el premio Isaiah Berlin por una vida de contribuciones a los estudios políticos. Uno de sus trabajos más influyentes se titula The Politics of Presence, The Political Representation of Gender, Race and Culture. Publicado en 1995, este libro se ha convertido en un referente indispensable para entender el trato que debería darse a ciertas minorías dentro de la política. Phillips argumenta que debemos evitar caer en posturas esencialistas sobre la identidad o el interés grupal y apostar por una política que incorpore tanto ideas como representaciones. Además de trabajar en temas relacionados con la democracia y la representación, la profesora Phillips ha escrito sobre la relación entre igualdad y diferencia, los vínculos problemáticos entre feminismo y liberalismo y entre el feminismo y el multiculturalismo. También ha dedicado buena parte de su producción académica al debate sobre los peligros de pensar al cuerpo como propiedad, la noción de humanidad como reivindicación política, y ha hecho una crítica a la idea de la igualdad de género como principio par excellence del pensamiento moderno. Su trabajo más reciente es un regreso a los temas de su disertación doctoral, publicada bajo el título The Enigma of Colonialism, donde discute los retos de pensar la teoría política más allá del eje euroestadounidense. Entre sus libros más importantes se encuentran The Politics of the Human, Our Bodies, Whose Properties y Gender and Culture. También tiene publicaciones en revistas de investigación de las más importantes en ciencias sociales y filosofía, como Political Theory, Social and Legal Studies, The Journal of Political Philosophy, entre otras. Y muchísimas gracias, Ana, por estar aquí con nosotras. Te damos la más grande bienvenida. Y la conferencia magistral que nos va a presentar el día de hoy se titula Why Don't Gender Theorists Talk More About Gender Equality?, que hemos traducido verbatim, ¿por qué las teóricas de género no hablan más sobre la igualdad de género? Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por tu generosa presentación y también por todo lo que has hecho para organizar mi visita. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí y tengo ganas de nuestras conversaciones. No puedo dar una conferencia en español todavía, entonces voy a hablar en inglés, pero antes quiero agradecer al Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Genero y al Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de UNAM, al Instituto Nacional de las Mujeres y a ONU Mujeres por haber hecho posible mi visita. Gracias. Y entonces en inglés. So I think my starting point is that in the course of the last decade, the language of gender equality has become firmly embedded in national and international documents. So UN Women, founded in 2010 as the United Nations organization dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. And on its website, it elaborates its mission as, quote, creating an environment in which every woman and girl can exercise her human rights and live up to her full potential. The Council of Europe, which is a key international human rights body founded in 1949, which did not even include gender in its original prohibited grounds of discrimination, now describes achieving gender equality as central to its mission. So it's come a long way. And its gender equality strategy aims at, quote, an equal visibility, empowerment, responsibility, and participation of both sexes in all spheres of public and private life. It also means an equal access to and distribution of resources between women and men. In Latin America, there is the Gender Equality Observatory, set up by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which monitors the progress of gender equality in member states. And this defines gender equality as, again, to quote, equality in the exercise of power, in decision-making, in mechanisms of social and political participation and representation, in diverse types of family relations, and in social, economic, political, and cultural relations. So I could go on, but I think any of us could collate similar statements from both national and international documents, which demonstrate the crucial importance, on paper at least, that is now accorded to the notion of gender equality. Most of the mission statements are recent, but the impression they give is that no self-respecting government can now afford to ignore the question of gender equality. Now, at the same time, we are witnessing often vicious attacks on the notion of gender. So just to give some examples, in Hungary, the Gender Studies Department of the Central European University has recently closed in the midst of major governmental attacks on the university itself. And in fact, the Hungarian government subsequently banned gender courses in any of its universities. Even using the term gender is said to disrupt the natural order in which women are women and men are men, and is said to undermine the sanctity of the family. And this is not an isolated phenomenon. I think both the Catholic Church and many of the evangelical churches have been targeting the language of gender for many years. Before he was elected Pope, for example, the previous Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger, described the concept of gender as, quote, an insurrection against the limits man carries within him as a biological being. And through the early 2000s, the Vatican produced a number of theological critiques of the notion of gender. In Brazil, in 2015, 8 state-level assemblies voted for the deletion of gender language in their educational policy. And it was also in Brazil in 2017 when Judith Butler was confronted by an angry demonstration at a conference she had co-organized, where her effigy depicting her as a witch was burnt. In the United States, the Trump administration has said that it would like to remove all references to gender in United Nations documents, replacing them by what it sees as the less problematic language of women. So there should be no reference to gender-based violence, for example, but only to violence against women. I mean, hopefully the results of the midterm elections mean that that kind of development doesn't go any further, but who knows. So the point there is that the normalization of the language of gender equality in so many governmental, national and international bodies is being accompanied by major counter-movements that reject the very language of gender. Now, we might see this as just the standard pattern. You know, gender equality becomes more mainstream. There's obviously a backlash against it. This is a kind of common pattern in politics. But I think in this instance, the mainstreaming and the backlash don't map on particularly neatly. For one of the things that strikes me forcefully about this moment is how little the gender theorists who are being attacked in this backlash, how little they employ the language of gender equality, which, as I say, is becoming embedded much more in national and international documents. The key words that it seems to me appear most commonly in books and articles on gender are terms like agency, subjectivity, affect. Equality, it seems to me, languages as a much less interesting term. Now, I used to think, I think this has been true for some time, and I used to think that this was because there was nothing much more to say about gender equality. You know, we know we want it, we know we don't have it, we clearly face major battles in our attempts to achieve it, but perhaps there just aren't any very interesting conceptual challenges in working on it, so gender theorists work on something else. I now think this is mistaken, and that the relative lack of engagement with notions of gender equality in contemporary gender theory speaks to deeper concerns. So I want to talk today about some of these concerns. Some of the reasons why feminists, and I think some of this is more broadly relevant to those just generally on the progressive left, but why feminists seem to have withdrawn relatively from the language of equality. As I hope will become clear, I recognize and I share many of the concerns that I think lie behind this shift, but I do not at all share the view that we should stop talking about gender equality. I think we need to understand equality as a transformative, not arithmetic ideal, but we cannot do without it. So in what follows, I just want to pick out what seem to me three aspects of what I see as a kind of a retreat from or a kind of problematization of the language of equality in some contemporary theory. So the first of these is broadly associated with post-colonial or decolonial critiques, and I'm thinking here of people like Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Walter Mignolo, theorists who've highlighted the violence that was visited, the violence that was visited on the colonized and the enslaved in that very period when what we think of as the modern conception of equality was being articulated. So if you take Fanon, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, he excoriated the humanism that pretended, as he saw it, to a belief in the indelible rights of man, and yet practiced a brutal dehumanization on its colonial subject. So he writes, quote, of this Europe, where they have never done talking of man with a capital M, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe. And I think this notion becomes a key point in post-colonial theory, the idea that this high-minded discourse about humanity and equality and the rights of man coincided with a violent dehumanization of most of the world's inhabitants. Now, we can, and I think some people do, tell a relatively benign story about this conjunction. We can say, and I think this is what many people say, we can say that, well, when people first started articulating notions of equality that broke with God-given or natural hierarchies, so say roughly from the 16th century onwards, we can say, well, they didn't yet have the imagination to see that all men being equal in a state of nature, which is one of the tropes that emerges in this period. They didn't yet have the imagination to see that all men might eventually mean all women too, or that given the assumptions of the period, they did not have the capacity to envisage that it might eventually come to mean all men and women, regardless of biology, physiognomy, beliefs, cultural practices, continent, and so on. In this, I think, rather complacent story about the way in which ideas develop, it was entirely understandable that notions of equality would have started out in a very limited way, but the logic of the ideas being articulated from several centuries ago then pressed beyond these limits to eventually deliver rights to all. This is not, in the view of most post-colonial theorists, nor I would say of my own, a very convincing explanation. I think one stumbling block is that if later ideas of equality for all were indeed logically implicit in those early, 16th, 17th century articulations, it took a very long time for that logic to assert itself. And I think an even more important stumbling block is that many people did have the imagination. In fact, as soon as people started talking about the equality of men in a state of nature, it was argued, sometimes in fact as the reason for rejecting this subversive argument, that once you go down that road, you're going to have to accept that women are equal too. So people started saying this right from the beginning, right? And when the French revolutionaries declared the rights of man in 1789, the ink was hardly dry on the declaration before people like Olympe de Gouges, the Marquis de Condorcet, Mary Wollstonecraft claimed these rights for women too. And it was only 2 years after the declaration that slaves in Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, took the proclamations, the French proclamations of the rights of man, as incompatible with slavery and embarked on the first large-scale slave revolution. My point there is that the denied and the excluded were in fact very quick to spot that this language of equality could be applied to them, but it was many centuries before the force of such arguments was to be conceded by those in power. So broadly, those writing in the post-colonial or decolonial mode are unimpressed by the happier story about things start in a very limited way and then gradually over the centuries they become extended to us all. And the more typical argument is that the violence and the inequality were part and parcel of the emerging understanding of equality and not an accidental accompaniment. So you can see how this casts a shadow over what the language of equality might actually mean if it's born out of this particular moment. So if you think, as an example of this, of the way notions of the human were being reframed and reinterpreted in this period, Sylvia Wynter, who's a Jamaican writer and cultural theorist, I think provides a compelling illustration in her analysis of the encounters between the Spanish conquistadores and communities of Caribs and so-called Indians in the Caribbean and the Americas in the 16th century, and looking at the justifications that the Spanish gave themselves for their destruction and enslavement of indigenous peoples. And she writes about the very famous dispute in the 1550s between the Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas, who came to devote himself to defending indigenous communities, and Gines de Sepúlveda, who defended the rights of the settlers to subject the Indians to the brutalities and forced labor of the encomienda system. And Wynter argues that if you look at that debate, that very famous debate, which is, in a sense revolved around the question of, do these people have souls? Are they human, right? She argues that Las Casas was still thinking within a very universalistic Christian ethic, in which the big difference between people was about the level of spiritual perfection that they were able to arrive at. And from his perspective, if you think that that's the kind of difference between people, then he saw no intrinsic difference between the Spanish and the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. In fact, considering the brutalities of the invaders, he thought that the indigenous inhabitants had a good claim to be at a higher spiritual state. And he also pointed out that there was no justification for treating people as Christ deniers before they'd even been given the opportunity of embracing Christianity. And this incidentally, was, I think, one of the stranger moments of these encounters. There was this brief period, I'm sure this is very familiar to you, but it only became clear to me relatively recently, when the Spanish settlers were required by decree from Spain to justify their enslavement of indigenous peoples by showing that they had refused the word of God. If they refused the word of God, you could do anything, right? Because they really kind of didn't figure as kind of, you know, as worthy of being treated with any kind of dignity or respect. So in this kind of, there was this brief period in which any slave raiding or land grabbing episode had to be preceded by a notary reading out to those about to be enslaved an entirely incomprehensible theological document in Latin, right? And when there was no reaction to this, people didn't immediately sign up to become kind of Christians as a result of this, then it was taken that the subsequent brutality was deemed justified. This approach worked, though entirely dishonestly, within the older religious mode. But the justification soon moved away from that, soon away from the willingness or otherwise to embrace Christianity, to claims about just how human people were. So this is kind of part of what Winter brings out of that debate, that Sepulveda notoriously described the peoples of the Americas as homunculi, you know, little people. And when he compared their capacities for reason with those of the Spanish, he saw them as almost, quote, like monkeys to men, right? So what you hear in this is a kind of a new, very hierarchical conception of natural differences between human beings. And for Winter, this is a key moment in the articulation of the modern conception of the human, which was not then a particularly egalitarian notion, rights for all, we're all human under the skin, but one marked from its origins by racism, hierarchy, and brutality. You know, and in this argument, the classification of humans by reference to their perceived capacity for reason then set in train the self-serving justifications that later served to justify the Atlantic slave trade, the colonization of India, the colonization of Africa. And in this new human norm, white European men were, in Winter's term, overrepresented. And she argues that this continues to legitimate racist institutions and discourse well into our own time. Now, if you think of the history of the notion of equality in that light, right, it gives many people pause for thought, though in fact it's notable that Winter or Fanon and many related writers, they don't say that we should now just abandon these deeply tainted notions of the human or humanity or equality. They don't say, you know, these notions are so tainted by their origins that we should just throw them away. But what they do stress is that once we recognize the kind of inequalities and the exclusions that were contained within the very idea of human equality, we have to abandon the delusion that equality is just a matter of extending the scope, including more and more people under the banner of the human, including us regardless of our race, gender, religion, and so on. And in particular, we have to break with any vestiges of biologism, including the biologism implied in degrees of rationality. In Winter's version, we should come to see the human as, to quote her, a hybrid, auto-instituting, languaging, storytelling species. Her work is really interesting. I've only recently discovered it, but for those of you who haven't come across this, she's really, really worth following up. I mean, I'm not myself entirely convinced by her alternative. I tend to the view that we should reject even improved and open definitions of the human as irrelevant to claims about equality, and I've argued this elsewhere in one of the books that Amneris mentioned, The Politics of the Human. But I do very much share this kind of analysis of the hierarchies and the exclusions that were built into the foundations of seemingly inclusive and egalitarian ideals. And I also share the view that this calls not for the abandonment of those ideals, but for their transformation. And I think actually this is one of the points that has been widely shared by feminists, anti-racists, and theorists of multiculturalism, that the pursuit of equality is not best understood as just extending the scope of the human, including more and more of the previously excluded within its remit, what you might describe as the, I too am human strategy. I think that formulation, when people say, look, I too am human, I mean, that's a very powerful strategy and can be extremely effective. But in a sense, it leaves untouched the original over-representation of particular kinds of human. I think we might infrequently employ that language as a way of exposing inconsistency and hypocrisy. But I think it's a mistake to represent the previous exclusions as just a failure of imagination. That's the kind of the happy story, the complacent story. There's a deeper problem here, and it argues against simpler strategies of extension and exclusion. But it doesn't at all render the language of human equality, or by extension, gender equality, meaningless. So that's the first kind of area, and it seems to me, to the extent that my perception that gender theorists talk less about gender equality than was the case in the past, I think part of it reflects that kind of skepticism about what you can do with the language of equality when it has such a sorry history, right? There's a second line of detachment, which also I think arises in engagement with global power hierarchies, but has been more focused on the substance of what we mean by gender equality. And I think this is something that's become an increasingly troubled issue in gender theory, where many now write about the difficulties of articulating universal ideals of equality or freedom without, in the process, smuggling in our own more parochial experiences and framework. If we believe that knowledge is in some sense situated, right, in some sense, framed by, affected by our own particular location, and it seems to me that most feminists incline to some version of this view that knowledge is situated, then we cannot but recognize that our own ideas of what constitutes equality are likely to reflect what we have experienced, read, or learned from those around us, rather than some straightforwardly universal truth. I mean, I say we cannot but of course very often we don't recognize this. It's not easy, and in fact, given the risks of political paralysis, perhaps not always desirable, but it's certainly not easy to sustain an attitude of continual doubt as regards your own most cherished beliefs. But if we don't recognize the ways in which we are simultaneously enabled and constrained by the context in which we find ourselves, which then affects our very capacity to think in certain ways, if we don't recognize that, we can become prey to assumptions of superiority over those who fall short of what we take to be the right way to live gender equality. Equality can then become a way to differentiate ourselves from those who appear to lack it. So we can scorn, for example, those women who are obsessively preoccupied with their physical beauty, or we can pity, from the other side, those who feel compelled to conceal their bodies from the male gaze in accordance with religious prescription. And we can congratulate ourselves on our superiority to these others who submit in multiple ways to patriarchal expectations. Now, if we do find ourselves thinking like this is clearly not a good position for a feminist to occupy. And yet sometimes the language of gender equality enables precisely that sense of superiority. Feminist theorist Serene Carder has been grappling with these issues for some time, recognizing on the one side the dangers of imposing a single conception of what gender equality ought to mean. But also she's very conscious that our worries about what you can broadly call cultural imperialism can lead to a kind of normative paralysis in which we feel unable to comment on other women's oppression. And I'm drawing here on some of the arguments she develops in a as yet unpublished book, though I think it will be in the bookstores by December, which is called Decolonizing Universalism, a transnational global ethic, which I found very, very helpful in thinking through some of these issues. And in this, Carter argues that the norm uniting feminism is and should be the goal of ending sexist oppression, which she defines as, quote, systemic disadvantage that accrues to a person by virtue of membership or perceived membership in a gender or as a result of a system of gender. But in her argument, judging something as oppressive, as gender oppression, need not depend on some kind of preconceived notion of what it would mean to be equal, right? So as she kind of points out, some feminists in the literature think that claiming your rights as an independent individual, right, unaffected by the influences of others, is a necessary component of gender equality. Though in the light of many criticisms in the literature about the notion of autonomy as a kind of self-sufficiency, that focus on equality as independence looks somewhat dubious. Other feminists have argued that equality requires the elimination of gender per se, as the feminist theorist Susan Moller-Okin once put this, quote, a just future would be one without gender. In its social structures and practices, one's sex would have no more relevance than one's eye color or the length of one's toes. Others, again, consider any kind of adherence to tradition as intrinsically at odds with women's freedom. So they see the refusal of any kind of traditional dictates as a crucial first step towards gender equality. Now, Serene Carter takes issue with all of these and stresses their tendency to reinforce or install a kind of global hierarchy, a hierarchy of those who think that they know and live better. Now, I think this aspect of her argument is relatively uncontroversial. We know that feminist endorsement of overly specific visions of a better life have sometimes become implicated with structures of neocolonial power. And I think she makes a convincing case that when conditions are oppressive, simply calling on women to assert their independence or to refuse the support of their kinship systems can have devastating consequences for their well-being. There are transition costs, that is, in moving from one set of oppressive circumstances to another that might or might not be better, and you don't yet know, but there are certainly going to be some transition costs. But you could accept, I mean, these are all points about context sensitivity, and I think a lot of feminist theory today is very aware of the importance of thinking about context and alerting ourselves to the ways in which this shapes and possibly distorts our arguments. But you could accept these points without fundamentally changing your views about what, in the long run, constitutes gender equality. I think the more difficult question that she raises is whether it makes sense to think that we can identify oppression or inequality without drawing on some prior notion of what it is to be free and equal. And I think many philosophers, I address this to you, many philosophers would doubt the coherence of separating out the critical from the positive in this way. They would say, to the contrary, that the first task of the theorist is to identify what constitutes justice or what constitutes equality, and then to use this to identify cases of injustice or inequality, or to put this in the language that became dominant in Anglo-American political theory, particularly since the work of John Rawls on the theory of justice. They believe that we must first work out the ideal theory, and then we can consider what to do in the non-ideal world. Now, Serene Carter is challenging this, and I think she's right to do so. It's not clear to me that we need to know what a just society looks like in order to identify something as injustice, or that we need to know what a state of perfect gender equality would look like in order to identify conditions of inequality. Now, I have to confess that for myself, I tend to the view that any division of labor based on gender is incompatible with gender equality. So a little bit like Susan Moller-Okin's notion that, you know, a just world would be a world without gender. But I'm willing to recognize this as a preference or a speculation. I do not need to establish it as the only way to think about gender equality in order to be able to identify circumstances where women are oppressed, disadvantaged, and unequal. Talk of gender equality risks giving the impression that we already know what that condition looks like. And maybe we should be more restrained in our use of that language and talk more about gender inequality instead. The crucial thing is to refuse the inequalities, not that we all come to agree on what a state of equality looks like. There's a third and older worry about equality, and this is my third point, which I think has been long rehearsed in the feminist literature. And this is to the effect that the language of equality suggests women equalizing themselves with men in a way that mistakenly equates equality with sameness and leaves men too much as the standard to which we should aspire. So in her book, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom, for example, Linda Zarelli argues that feminists should shift their attention from equality and identity and focus more on action and freedom. And part of her reason for this is that, quote, the political principle of equality has tended to level all social and sexual differences and to force the assimilation of women to a masculine standard disguised as neutral and universal, not university. So yes, indeed, but I think this is an argument that we've been having for many years. And I imagine that all today's gender theorists would agree in repudiating what the English feminist Eleanor Rathbone described nearly a century ago as a kind of Me Too feminism, yo tambien feminism, that simply claims for women an equal share of whatever rights and resources men have previously achieved for themselves. So men have the vote, women should have the vote, men have the right to work, women should have the right to work, men have the right to education, women should have the right to education. And she saw this, or she argued 100 years ago, that the kind of Me Too feminism that is too limited in the way it defines itself, it patently leaves untouched all the important things that men didn't bother to campaign for, including new ways of organizing the care work that is so central to women's experience and has been so poorly addressed by governments of virtually all political complexion. But it also leaves untouched the very conception of gender, because it seems to take for granted that there are two pre-constituted groups, the female sex and the male sex, or the feminine gender and the masculine gender, whose relative positions now need to be equalized. Yet if we think of gender equality in this way, it seems to me that we miss the key thing that we are challenging about the gender order. The key thing that we're challenging is those endless attempts to corral us into two distinct groups, to make us either male or female, masculine or feminine, and to define us through practices of gender. And I think the point here is not just that a language of equalizing the genders makes it harder to address those who are transgender or who define themselves as gender fluid, though this is clearly a problem and certainly true. But I think the issue is a wider one, and it touches on everyone's need to get beyond the categorizations. And I think the point comes over clearly if you think of it in comparison with the way that we think about racial equality. I think as regards racial equality, it seems to me it's now very widely accepted that the category of race is itself a racist product, right? It's attaching various psychological, intellectual, and emotional capacities to the nature of our skin color or physiognomy, right? Now, if you accept that critique, if you accept the kind of the argument that the very category of race is part of the kind of the institution of racism, right? Then you can't think of racial equality as the pursuit of equality between race A and race B. because framing it like that would mean that you were accepting without question that there are indeed these distinct races that need to be equalized. Now, you might say there's a slightly more biological basis for a distinction between male and female, but it seems to me that much the same point applies to gender equality. You can't think of equality, of gender equality, as equality between gender A and gender B, because framing it like that accepts too much the reality of those gender distinctions. Now, I think this is a crucially important reminder. Though again, it doesn't mean we have to drop the language of equality. It just means, I think, that we have to be careful about the way in which we use it. And Zarrilli herself doesn't say we should stop talking about equality, but she does very strongly argue that we should shift the focus from equality to freedom. And in doing so, she draws inspiration from Hannah Arendt's conception of the political realm as the arena within which we can practice freedom and create the world anew. I have to say, thinking of politics as the arena in which we practice freedom and create the world anew is, to me, a rather extravagant understanding of the political and not easily recognizable in the actual practices of politics. But it's additionally troubling in the way it seems to minimize the importance of the social realm. This was always a criticism of Hannah Arendt's work, that she was famously distrustful of what she saw as the 20th century preoccupation with poverty, low income, inadequate housing, poor health. She saw this preoccupation as encouraging an overly instrumental view of politics and underplaying what she saw as the world-changing practice of politics. Now, Zarrilli distances herself from some of this indifference to the social, but broadly she shares Arendt's perspective. She wants what she calls a freedom-centered feminism, striving to bring about transformation in the normative conceptions of gender, and she encourages us to see feminism, quote, as a conflict-ridden, world-building practice of freedom. Now, I have no problem with the idea of feminism as action, nor with the notion that claiming rights is more transformative of who we are and how we see ourselves than simply being given them. But there's something rather ungrounded, I think, in this celebration of freedom and action as if they are ends in themselves. And I find I can't let go of my own preoccupation with women's greater economic vulnerability, greater vulnerability to violence, and lesser access to political influence and power. So as I hope is clear from what I've said so far, I do see much of importance in these reasons for worrying about the language of equality. But I remain myself very much a devotee of gender equality. And I take the message of all three concerns as calling for transformations in the ways we understand and deploy notions of equality and inequality, not as reasons for abandonment. And I want to end with a brief illustration as regards the issue of abortion, which is something that has been and continues to be a particularly important issue for feminists in Latin America. Now, one of the long-standing debates about reproductive rights has been whether we should frame the demand for safe and legal abortion in terms of a woman's right to choose, which is a sort of language very often used in the politics around reproductive rights. Should we frame it in terms of a woman's right to choose, or, as was the case in the United States, as protected a privacy right, a right not to be interfered with by the state in something that's a private matter protected by the Constitution? Or should we see it in terms of our rights to do as we wish with our own bodies? Or should we see it as a matter of equality? There are problems potentially with all of these. When it's framed as a woman's right to choose, it seems to me it becomes vulnerable to the argument that it can legitimate female feticide. I mean, this is an argument that's made by a number of Indian feminists, including Nivedita Menon, who've pointed out that in highly patriarchal societies where giving birth to girl children can mark one as an inferior wife, putting one at risk of repudiation or even death, women may well choose selective termination of girl fetuses in order to ensure they give birth only to boys. Now, we could say, oh, well, this isn't women choosing, right? But it's women choosing under conditions that come very close to coercion, and you could sort of argue that. But I think even so, the example throws up worries about framing reproductive rights only in the language of a woman's right to choose. And I think it reminds us of that point that I made earlier, that many of the ways we define political goals may be overly shaped by our own specific experience. Framing abortion as a privacy right worked successfully for many decades in the United States, though is now, of course, very much threatened there, but has also been criticized, most notably by Catherine McKinnon. As McKinnon stresses, feminists do not, on the whole, want to shelter behind privacy rights when it comes to other issues. You know, we don't want violence within the home to be treated as a private matter. We don't want sexual harassment to be regarded as a private matter of interpersonal relations. We want to challenge much of what is assumed about the public-private divide. I also myself think it problematic to frame abortion as a property right, which is the third way that you might think of it, because this encourages us to think of our bodies as property, this is my body to do what I like with, and to think of property as something over which we can assert control. And I don't have time to expand on this, but in a recent book on Our Bodies, Whose Property, I take issue with the use of that property metaphor to conceptualize our relationships with our bodies and argue that the implied mind-body dualism fails to recognize the sense in which we are our bodies. I also take issue with the idea that if something is property, then this means we can do, no one else can tell us what to do with it. You know, if you thought that, then you'd be refusing the rights of governments to impose taxes, set rent controls, or insist on planning permission, or all sorts of ways in which governments do and should continue to regulate private property. So each of these arguments for reproductive rights has its weaknesses. And for me, it's impossible to capture why we need the right to free and legal abortion without appealing to the notion of equality. It seems to me that at its heart is the fact that it is women, and only women, who get pregnant, that treating abortion as a criminal act subjects women, but only women, to unwanted pregnancies, leads women, but only women, to die in illicit backstreet abortions. And given the continuing gender division of labor as regards the way we care for our children, it means that women, and mainly women, will be the ones who have to find a way to feed and clothe and care for children in conditions where they knew in advance it would be almost impossible. So refusing women any right, any access to abortion, co-opts women's bodies, but only women's bodies, to sustain the life of the fetus. It seems to me that there's a pressing issue of equality here, but it's also a good case where it needs to be equality transformed. I mean, if you just left it like that, it would seem too much like a case of that kind of Me Too feminism that I mentioned before. You know, an argument like, you might be saying, well, you know, nobody requires men to give over their bodies for 9 months, you know, so nobody should require this of women either, right? You know, you could frame it in that way. You could say, you know, nobody expects this of men, so, you know, women should have the right not to do this. Now, putting it like that hardly addresses the complexities and the potential anguish of abortion. But also, since pregnancy can never be shared equally between women and men, framing the demand in these somewhat arithmetic terms seems to miss the point. And I think I prefer to see the issue as offering a further illustration of what the kind of argument that Serene Carter is developing. We can see that denying access to free and legal abortion oppresses women and treats them as beings of lesser importance. But we can see that without necessarily knowing what in this context it would mean to treat women and men equally, right? You can sort of separate out these two things. So this is my main point, and it's not, I think, an entirely novel one. None of the points we make ever are. Neither equality nor inequality is a simple notion. And I think equality in particular comes to us weighed down with very considerable historical baggage. with all this in mind, I am sometimes frustrated by the mission statements that are adopted in national and international documents when it seems to me they fail to acknowledge the complexity or represent the goal of gender equality as more straightforward than it is. I think we need to reclaim equality from some overly bland statements of it and accept the challenge of complexity. But we need to do this in order to put ways of thinking about gender equality back at the heart of gender theory. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Anne, por esta reflexión. Quisiera decir que una de las muchas ventajas que tiene estar al frente de la organización de un evento o de un coloquio es que puedes elegir si quieres comentar a la ponencia magistral. Entonces tuve ese gran privilegio de pensar que puedo hacer un comentario que esté al nivel y que le haga justicia a las reflexiones que nos has mostrado, que nos has compartido el día de hoy, y que sobre todo pienso que este foro lo que busca es tener una discusión que podamos compartir tanto aquellas cosas con las que estamos de acuerdo como las que no. Ahora, yo había preparado mi comentario, porque también una de las ventajas es que tuve acceso a esta ponencia con antelación, y preparé un comentario al que titulé ¿y qué es la igualdad de género? Ahora, volviendo a reflexionar un poco a la luz de la ponencia magistral de Anne Phillips, creo que hay muchas cosas que dejé fuera de mi comentario escrito que quizás son importantes y quizá podamos discutir más adelante. Y también creo que en ese sentido otro título de mi comentario podría ser, pues, ¿qué dice del feminismo el que no hablemos sobre la igualdad de género, ¿no? ¿Qué está pasando con el feminismo dentro de la academia? Porque al final del día estamos hablando de cómo construimos problemas de investigación, ¿no? Y cómo problematizamos ciertas desigualdades, si nos pasan de largo o si no. Y eso tiene consecuencias no solo en la creación de conocimiento y de saberes, sino también en la creación de ideales, ¿no? De ideales regulativos que sí nos conduzcan a pensar en cómo es una sociedad más igualitaria, una sociedad más justa, una sociedad decente. Bueno, habiendo dicho eso, ahora voy a proceder a leer mi comentario. Lo voy a leer no con la intención de aburrirles, sino para evitar mi tendencia a divagar. En ¿por qué las teóricas de género no hablan más acerca de la igualdad de género? Anne Phillips se refiere a 3 razones principales que ayudan a explicar lo que denomina una retirada de la igualdad o una falta de problematización del lenguaje de género. La primera razón viene de la teoría poscolonial, que sospecha de la lógica interna de la igualdad. Una lógica según la cual todos aquellos sujetos que estaban o aún están privados del estatus de lo humano y por lo tanto son considerados inferiores y desiguales, serán incluidos gradualmente dentro de su círculo. La segunda razón se preocupa de que el pretendido universalismo de la igualdad contribuya a crear jerarquías entre las culturas y los pueblos con respecto a la forma correcta de vivir la igualdad de género, lo que provoca titubeos en los debates feministas, en los debates entre feministas de diferentes partes del mundo. La tercera razón para la retirada tiene que ver con el temor de que la búsqueda de la igualdad se confunda con la pretensión de que las mujeres se vuelvan idénticas a los varones. Aquí la igualdad debe ocupar un segundo plano, pues debemos ir más allá de las categorías binarias de género, en lugar de profundizar en ellas. Lo más interesante, señala Phillips, es que independientemente de cuán agudas sean estas razones, ninguna de ellas sugiere que la igualdad no sea importante o que nuestro panorama moral pueda prescindir de ella. De ahí su llamado a entender la igualdad como un ideal transformador. La posición de Phillips asume que la igualdad es algo de valor. Quizás se objete mi uso de la palabra valor debido a sus matices kantianos. No obstante, creo que ese es exactamente el punto. La igualdad tiene un valor en sí misma, como un principio que guía la empresa y la interacción humanas, en la medida en que es un requisito para cualquier sociedad que se considera justa, civil, decente. Ahí habría que hacer una pequeña acotación sobre a qué me refiero a una sociedad civil y decente. Aquí hablo un poco a la luz del trabajo de Avishai Margalit, que nos dice que una sociedad civil es aquella en donde las y los ciudadanos se tratan con respeto, mientras que una sociedad decente es aquella donde las instituciones no humillan a sus ciudadanos. Las sociedades imperfectas, como la nuestra, necesitan mirar e imaginar formas de igualdad no existentes para conducir sus desiguales estructuras, instituciones, políticas e interacciones hacia esas formas. A pesar de esto, el trabajo de Phillips no se centra en la idea de la igualdad como principio, sino que su preocupación yace en la política de la igualdad. En un artículo recientemente publicado titulado Gender and Modernity, Phillips subraya, y cito, lo que sucede con nociones como la igualdad depende en gran medida de lo que la gente haga posteriormente con ellas, de cómo reaccionan con los movimientos y preocupaciones políticas y del tipo de reclamos que se hacen en su nombre. Es en la política de la igualdad que sus valores son refinados y reformulados, no en el desarrollo de algún ideal inherentemente moderno. Fin de la cita. Es decir, son los usos concretos y también los malos usos de la igualdad en el ámbito político los que dan forma a la igualdad como principio y no al revés. En otras palabras, la igualdad parece insignificante fuera de la lucha política entre individuos que discrepan sobre sus valores y significados. Cuando a alguien se le impide ingresar al club de la igualdad debido a características accidentales como su género, raza, clase u orientación sexual, lo que sigue o lo que debería seguir es la lucha política, no la expectativa de que el principio de igualdad lleve a cabo una rectificación espontánea de sí mismo. Si esto nos suena familiar a las feministas es porque las mujeres del siglo XVIII se vieron explícitamente excluidas del recién creado Club de la Igualdad. ¿Qué hicieron entonces? Dirigieron una movilización política e intelectual que identificó las contradicciones sobre las cuales se fundó el ideal de igualdad. Lucharon. Si hubieran esperado a que la lógica interna de la igualdad se pusiera en marcha, la historia habría sido muy diferente. Es más, podría ser que ni siquiera estuviéramos hoy aquí. Esta noción de la igualdad es clave para la teorización feminista sobre la igualdad de género y esencial para el sabemos que la queremos y sabemos que no la tenemos, y da lugar a la idea de que la igualdad de género significa libertad y emancipación de la opresión sexista. Siguiendo a Kate Mann, el sexismo debe entenderse como, cito, la rama justificativa de un orden patriarcal consistente en una ideología que tiene la función general de racionalizar y justificar las relaciones sociales patriarcales. Fin de la cita. Para Mann, el sexismo contribuye a neutralizar las diferencias sexuales y a presentar sus arreglos sociales como inevitables. Sin embargo, lo más preocupante es que retrata a las personas que intentan resistirse al orden patriarcal como si estuvieran luchando una batalla perdida. ¿Para qué serviría impulsar, por ejemplo, una división más equitativa del trabajo entre los sexos si hombres y mujeres fueran naturalmente diferentes? El sexismo es, pues, una ideología que informa y perpetúa la desigualdad de género como una opresión natural e irremediable. Además, no funciona en solitario, en la medida en que involucra concepciones arraigadas de lo que son las mujeres y los hombres, de lo que son los valores femeninos y masculinos y su asignación jerárquica en la sociedad. En consecuencia, la distribución desigual del poder político, económico y social entre los sexos se acepta sin discusión en grandes sectores de la población. Tal estado de cosas llama a revisar los objetivos y los alcances del feminismo como teoría y práctica. De ahí que tengamos este coloquio. Phillips, basándose en Serene Kader, está de acuerdo en que el feminismo debería preocuparse por acabar con la opresión sexista a través de la noción de igualdad transformada, de la que me gustaría que en algún momento nos hablara un poquito más. Esta es, en mi opinión, la parte más provocadora de su trabajo. Ahora, con el fin de dar contenido a la igualdad transformada, en mi lectura de Phillips, ella se refiere al aborto, pero lo hace indicando las debilidades de los argumentos que guían los debates sobre salud pública, los derechos y la privacidad. En cambio, nos invita a pensar este problema tan centrado en los cuerpos de las mujeres como un asunto de igualdad, aunque no en el sentido de tener los mismos derechos, sino más bien en el sentido de vivir en condiciones no opresivas. Forzar el embarazo o la maternidad sobre una persona es una forma de opresión que las mujeres se enfrentan de manera abrumadora y que en muchos casos conduce al encarcelamiento o la muerte. Esta opresión es sexista, pues asume una visión esencialista de las mujeres como madres en razón de su biología y las castiga por tratar de evitar su destino natural. Utilizando la terminología de la igualdad de género, se podrá decir que la demanda de las mujeres latinoamericanas por el derecho al aborto libre y legal es, al final, una demanda de igualdad entendida como no opresión sobre sus cuerpos y sus vidas, una demanda de emancipación y un desafío directo a la ideología sexista. Estoy de acuerdo con esta posición. Sin embargo, también creo que la lucha política por la igualdad de género tiene que ver con prácticas de humanización. En resumen, ser igual también implica ser vista y tratada como un ser humano, ser reconocida. Phillips ha escrito extensamente sobre este tema. En The Politics of the Human, habla de lo problemático que resulta encontrar un rasgo común que una a todos los integrantes de la especie humana, ya que supone la tarea imposible de separar, cito, nuestro yo central, la humanidad que compartimos, de los rasgos contingentes que nos hacen quienes somos y representar esas contingencias como si fuesen de menor importancia y tal vez incluso como motivo para sentirnos un poco avergonzadas. Fin de la cita. En esta narrativa, ser humano significa dejar nuestro género, origen étnico, clase y orientación sexual a las puertas del Club de la Igualdad. También significa participar en una política de nivelación paternalista en la que la decisión de etiquetar a otros como humanos, de permitirles la entrada al club, depende de unos cuantos poderosos. Para ella, la política de lo humano consiste, como en la política de la igualdad, en una lucha política. El significado de ser humano no se decide a priori, sino en combate. Históricamente, las mujeres y otros grupos marginados han sido privados del estatus de ser humano. Esto supone ser vistas y tratadas como inferiores. La lucha de las mujeres y otros grupos marginados para ser reconocidos como humanos es ciertamente política en el sentido que menciona Anne Phillips, pero también es una lucha ética que requiere una nivelación no paternalista en donde distintas prácticas sociales de humanización se traduzcan, por ejemplo, en reformas constitucionales, en declaraciones de derechos humanos, pero sobre todo en narrativas del día a día entre personas concretas que afirmen que nosotras somos seres humanos, pero no a pesar de nuestro género, origen étnico, clase u orientación sexual, sino debido a ellos. Este proceso ético de reconocimiento y de nivelación no paternalista debe ser paralelo a las luchas políticas. Ambos procesos son necesarios para acercarnos a la igualdad. La opresión sexista, ahora, no es el único problema que informa la desigualdad en las relaciones de género. Y con esto quisiera terminar mi comentario. El sistema económico actual juega un importante papel en la configuración de lo que significa ser hombre o ser mujer, así como la reproducción del sexismo en las esferas doméstica, privada y pública. Aquí también las feministas de todos los ámbitos debemos tener cuidado con los peligros de participar en luchas por la igualdad de género que son meramente instrumentales y permanecen impasibles ante el problema más profundo del binarismo de género, o que asumen que la igualdad económica es el objetivo principal. La lucha por la igualdad no puede ignorar el impacto que tienen las lógicas del mercado en la vida de cada individuo y la forma en que constituye nuevas formas de opresión de género. La exacerbación, mutación y aparición de nuevas formas de sexismo es por lo que yo creo que necesitamos escuchar a Phillips con atención y comenzar a hablar más sobre igualdad de género. Muchas gracias. Bueno, vamos a seguir con las preguntas de la audiencia.
Sí,
¿Sí?
sí.
Entonces yo voy a leer las preguntas en español y el traductor hará su magia. Bueno, también tengo que hacer yo un poco de magia porque no entiendo. A ver. No. En lo que la descifro, voy a leer esta otra. Quizás pensar a cabildar la equidad de género requiere no solo atender al término equidad, sino al término género. Quizá no basta hablar de género como rol de género, sino de otros términos como cuerpo, identidad, sujeto. Pensar al género en sus conexiones con el deseo. La equidad no podría consistir en aplanar las diferentes formas de desear y habitar el cuerpo. Esto lo digo porque en la ponencia se han borrado a los hombres trans de la discusión del aborto. La equidad de género, que no reconoce los cruces entre género y corporalidad, termina por pensar en términos de roles y nada más. De allí el abolicionismo. Pero si pensamos en cuerpos, quizá apostar por su equiparamiento conduce a injusticias e inequidades. ¿Qué piensa de esto? Do you want us to make a round of questions and then you answer, or you want to answer one by one? We can make.
Which do you prefer?
That's up to you. Probably a round of questions.
Well, let me go one by one.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. So I see two things in that first question. One is, I mean, there are two terms under question here, both gender and equality. And in fact, when I opened my comments with the sort of public attacks on the notion of gender, those, of course, are driven very much by this idea that gender theory, in its kind of detachment of gender from biological sex, has opened up a whole kind of critique of the family and a natural order. So that there's a kind of major battle for gender theorists in terms of being able to defend and develop the use of the term gender, which I said less about in my talk, except insofar as trying to problematize the idea that gender equality is an equalizing between two somehow already marked out and identifiable genders. Now, I kind of, I mean, I agree with the kind of the position behind the question of drawing attention to that, it's a useful thought about the extent to which, in my framing of the inequality that is at the heart of denying women the right to safe and legal abortion, I'm actually falling again into a kind of an acceptance of, two categorical groupings, women and men, which are then being compared to one another. I guess with pregnancy, which is kind of one of the very few biological points at which one can kind of sort of talk about some kind of real body basis for some of the ways in which we construct gender. I think both that there's a legitimacy in what I've argued, but also I think there's an important question and challenge that's been posed to me which I shall think more about. So thank you for that question.
Okay. En un contexto de gran desigualdad fomentado por el neoliberalismo.
Puedes repetir. Sí, un momento.
En un contexto de gran desigualdad fomentado por el neoliberalismo como imperante en el mundo, ¿cómo se debe ver el concepto de igualdad de género y el papel del feminismo ante esto?
Okay, so question about neoliberalism. I think one of the major impacts of neoliberalism in the way in which we think, in the feminist discourses, is the way that it has strengthened ways of thinking about equality which are about assertion of equal rights, assertion of rights as individuals. There's a whole way in which, we become affected by, decades now of a kind of dominant neoliberal discourse, which makes it very hard to think about gender equality without falling into a very individualist way of asserting, for example, my rights over my own body, or asserting equality as I want to have the same rights as other people have. This, to me, is one of the problematic effects of neoliberalism. The most problematic effects of neoliberalism are in the social and economic sphere, but there are also important effects in our discourse, so that I think that, that neoliberalism poses a challenge to feminism about trying to protect ourselves from that slide into very individualized ways of thinking about what the challenges of gender equality are.
Para usted, ¿las teorías feministas sobre la decolonialidad son multiculturalismo?
Okay, yes, thank you for that question. I see the literature on multiculturalism and the literature on decolonialism as rather distinct, in fact. Broadly, I would say the literature on multiculturalism, I may be thinking too much within the European context, but we're all defined by our own context. The literature on multiculturalism, it seems to me, is searching for a way of thinking about equal citizenship in societies that are culturally diverse. So it's framed by an acceptance of certain liberal ideas of equality, citizenship, rights, and a recognition that in societies that actually have very considerable cultural diversity, this promise has not been delivered, right? So multiculturalism is, as I understand it, is working towards ways of thinking, what does it actually mean to be recognized as an equal citizen with the same rights as other citizens in a society where, in a sense, there has been a set of cultural assumptions which have favored certain groups over others, right? So it's within that kind of framework. One of my criticisms of some of the literature on multiculturalism is that I think it very much overstates the significance of cultural diversity and often encourages all kinds of cultural stereotypings that are deeply problematic, but set that to one side. I see that as different from the challenge that is posed by the decolonial literature, because the decolonial literature is asking us to think not just about how the liberal promises of equality and rights and citizenship have failed to deliver to particular groups of citizens. The decolonial literature is asking us to think more deeply about what might be real problems within those very ways of thinking about equality, rights, freedom. So going back to this kind of question about ways in which the original framing of many of the ideas that still inspire us when we think about equality and citizenship, the original framing of those had, built into them already various kinds of hierarchies and distinctions that you can't just simply kind of, cut out and ignore without possibly some more fundamental change. I mean, I'm aware at this point that I'm open to the challenge that, in a sense, you're posing me, which is what exactly do I mean by this transformation, which I'm inclined to just throw back to you. You know, you've kind of, we're all engaged in this journey. But I do think that, I mean, there are some illustrations that you can take from existing, well, there's clearly been a transformation, largely as a result of a lot of the feminist and also, I think, anti-racist work around challenging the idea of equality as sameness, around thinking about the kind of the being able to think of people as equal without having to deny ways in which you don't fit some kind of, dominant cultural or political norm. I think there's a lot of transformation that's already taken place. And I think there will be much more. But I think in terms of the transformations that are demanded by the decolonial literature, they are much more extensive than the transformations demanded by the multicultural literature. I mean, if I were just to put it simply, the multicultural literature is asking us to deliver on the promises implied in these ideas of equal citizenship in a world where virtually no country has a kind of, a single homogeneous culture, right? It's asking us to deliver on that. The decolonial literature I see as asking us to probe a bit more deeply into the nature of those notions of equality and rights, and to do some more kind of thinking about ways in which their history remains part of the way in which they've been formulated. I've traveled further in my thinking about multiculturalism than I have traveled so far in my thinking about the decolonial literature, but it seems to me those are the differences.
Sobre ese punto me gustaría solo insistir un poquito. ¿Crees que es correcto entonces hacer una distinción sobre el posicionamiento epistemológico, por un lado, del multiculturalismo, que si bien se inserta de manera problemática, se inserta dentro del liberalismo, ¿no? Para hablar de cuestiones de derechos, de acceso a la ciudadanía, ¿no? Y de reconocimiento de sociedades multiculturales diversas? Y la postura colonial, o la teoría postcolonial, lo que muestra es un rechazo quizá más rotundo de algunos de los preceptos más importantes del neoliberalismo, sin necesariamente, por ahora, supongo que esa no es parte de su búsqueda, sin necesariamente insertarse en políticas públicas. ¿Podría ser una forma también de distinguir ambos como posicionamientos epistemológicos?
Well, I think I'd very much agree the way you characterize multiculturalism to begin with. I think I'm less sure about the idea of simple rejection in thinking about the decolonial or post-colonial literature. Because I think there's much more of a, trying to think about how one can mobilize notions like humanity, equality, in ways which don't carry with them the various kinds of exclusions and denials that have been part of their history. I think that's a challenge that a lot of people in the decolonial literature set themselves. But I do also think that I've certainly been in conversations with people who are much more influenced by the decolonial literature than I am, who've said, why don't you just give up on the language of equality, right? So there is sometimes that's also a kind of an element in it. So there's a discussion that's going on there, I think, within that literature. But to say rejection is possibly overstrong.
Okay. Yeah. Back to equality transformed. ¿Cómo implementar políticas públicas a través del concepto igualdad transformada?
Right.
Yeah. Do you want to escape?
Yeah. Okay, so well, first of all, I think the idea that equality isn't about kind of, first of all, it's not about an arithmetic ideal, and secondly, it's not about an equalizing of two groups whose constitution you simply take for granted, and you don't think about what's gone into creating those groups and sustaining those groups and putting us all under this immense normative pressure to become women and men in the model of what our society demands of us. So that always has to be a kind of central part in the way in which we think about public policy, that it's kind of, that it contains within it a critique of the gender norms, which are, you know, constantly, you know, trying to kind of push us back into some kind of, you know, simple categories, at the same time as challenging the discriminations and the inequalities. And it is a challenge for public policy, because if you're tackling discrimination, so if you're tackling discrimination on the grounds of gender, say, one of the things that seems like an obvious line to take is to say people should have the same access to rights to whatever, education, housing, employment, legal assistance, regardless of their gender, right? And that seems an obvious way to kind of think about what discrimination is, which is a kind of saying, you know, we should see people just as human beings. We shouldn't see them in terms of their gender identities or their cultural identities or their religious identities. We should see them just as human beings. But of course, you know, one of the things that people object to is the idea that, so if somebody says to me, you know, I don't see you as a woman, I see you just as a human being, I'm not actually terribly pleased by that. Because it seems to me that's like saying the only way I can see you as a human being is by not noticing that you are also a woman. So we don't want that. But I think in the world of public policy, particularly if you're dealing with cases of very overt discrimination, there's a lot of pressure to kind of come up with policies which are about people having the same access to something regardless of whether they are this, that, or the other. And there's lots of contexts in which that's the right kind of thing to do, but there are other contexts in which that seems to be simply accepting the norms of gender differentiation. So I think working in the field of public policy in this area requires extraordinarily nuanced and complex ways of thinking about these issues. It's a much more challenging field than might seem when you read the documents that suggest that what we want is gender equality and it's all very simple, we'll just get it. You know, anyone working in this field is very sensitive, I think, to the enormous complexities that go along with that.
¿Cómo entender una igualdad jurídica en consonancia con las diferencias histórico-identitarias en una estructura social colonial? That's it. Okay. ¿Cómo podemos definir o categorizar los temas de una, entre comillas, agenda de género de las legisladoras sin un ideal de lo que es la igualdad de género? Should I go? ¿Cómo podemos definir o categorizar los temas de una agenda de género de las legisladoras sin un ideal de lo que es la igualdad de género?
Yeah, I get that one.
Sí.
Yeah.
La primera también.
About legal equality?
Yeah. ¿Cómo entender una igualdad jurídica en consonancia con las diferencias histórico-identitarias en una estructura social colonial?
Yeah, clear but difficult. Okay, so just to take the second aspect about can we have a gender agenda, an agenda for transforming the gender structures of our societies without having a clearly formed idea of what the goal of gender equality is. It might seem obvious that we must have that idea of a goal. But I have become convinced over the years that focusing on inequality or injustice is actually more productive than trying to kind of devote ourselves to working out a kind of perfect image of what justice or equality constitutes. And it's partly for the reasons that I set out in the lecture about the ways in which once one has a very strong idea of gender equality, that you end up with, you expose yourself to this ways in which you are imposing a very specific ideal of what, what should be the way in which we should organize future societies. So I think the kind of shifting from a focus on equality to a focus on inequality, or a focus on from justice to injustice, it seems to me a very important part of the project. Of course, one will still frame one's goal in terms of what we want is justice, what we want is equality. It's not that we'll kind of stop using those terms. But I think the kind of it seems to me increasingly to make more sense to focus on the kind of the ways in which we can identify inequalities and injustice, which I no longer think, I think I used to, I no longer think we need we need a measure of what equality is in order to identify inequality. In very rough and broad senses we do, of course. They can't be completely separated out. But in any very specific sense, I think there is a kind of a case for separating them out, and a good political case. And then on the related kind of first point about how, given the kind of the history of inequalities and hierarchies and exclusions, how, when one's trying to challenge those, what kind of difference does it make to your notion of legal equality? Well, here, of course, I think there has been a lot of very important and productive work that's taken place within the remit of thinking about multiculturalism, where one of the things that comes out there very much is that there are certain circumstances in which what we need is a notion of legal equality regardless of who we are, but in many other contexts in the same society, what we need is a notion of legal equality that recognizes those histories and those structures. That simply saying, we will now treat you all the same, it is a kind of denial of what may be whole structures of inequality and oppression, which make it impossible for us to simply make use of these so-called legal rights. So it's not a critique of the idea of legal equality, which is an important and compelling ideal that people have struggled for many centuries. But it is a kind of a critique of the idea that legal equality can be simply understood as a kind of equality that people have, which kind of, in a sense, disregards the kind of the very power of both the social structures and the norms. And certainly when you think about what it means to ensure that men and women have legal equality, or what it means to ensure that people who are transgender have legal equality, that simply saying everyone should be treated as an equal regardless of who they are doesn't actually help you solve many of the very specific policy issues that are associated with that. I don't know if that helps clarify, but I see there are more questions.
Y me voy a permitir presionar un poquito más en ese sentido.
Okay.
has mencionado que tenemos un sentido de la igualdad, ¿no? Que es un poco similar a el sentido de la justicia, ¿no? Que a veces nos hablan teóricos como Rawls o Nozick. Y sí creo que podemos decir que en general las personas tendemos a crear ciertos ideales sobre lo que constituiría una sociedad igualitaria, ¿no? Pero también en la construcción de un problema de investigación, ¿no? Dentro de la academia. Yo recuerdo cuando comencé a hacer mi tesis doctoral sobre un concepto que tú sí rechazas, el de dignidad, y hemos hablado de esto antes. Recuerdo que mi supervisor me decía, vamos a comenzar a explorar el concepto de dignidad a través de lo que creemos que no es la dignidad, ¿no? A través de lo opuesto, para así comenzar a explorar y poder robustecer a qué nos referimos, de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de dignidad. Entonces había ahí, en cierta manera, un sentido implícito de a dónde queremos llegar, pero no sabíamos si el camino nos iba a llevar hasta ello. ¿Crees que podemos hacer una similitud, una semejanza cuando hablamos de un sentido de la igualdad, o sea, sin tenerlo quizá de una manera tan precisa, sin pensarlo, con características muy concretas, pero ¿a eso crees que te estás refiriendo cuando hablas de un sentido de la igualdad?
Okay, I think that that phrase about exploring something through what it is not is actually very helpful, right? And that does correspond to some of what I'm arguing today about, in a sense, exploring what equality is through focusing on what we can see are cases of inequality and injustice, and working from there rather than the other way around, which actually I think is what people do mostly when they're working in the field of policies as regards gender equality. People don't have a philosophical discussion in which they pin down exactly what they're aiming towards. There are certain very obvious things that are cases of inequality and injustice, where I think explore through what it is not is very helpful. But can I say something else about this notion about a sense of equality? And this is just a sort of slightly different thought, really. It seems to me one of the So I've talked in the talk about how there's a story that we tell ourselves which I don't think is a convincing story, which is that people started coming up with this modern idea of equality several centuries ago, equality which didn't assume a natural hierarchy. It took them a long time to extend it to women. It took them a long time to see that it included potentially all human beings. There's a story that we tell ourselves there, which I think is not a good story, which is about a kind of steady progression from an initial very limited idea of equality to a much later one. And there was no historical inevitability in that. It all had to be fought for, and it had to be fought very hard for. There's another story we tell ourselves, I think, which is which suggests that we have a kind of basic sense of equality, now in the 21st century, that, in some basic sense, all human beings are to be regarded as equals. But then the question of, what that means in terms of social and economic structures, or what that means in terms of any more substantive organization of society, or in relation to how we organize the care work within our society, all of these things we continue to disagree about. And I've increasingly come to the view that we don't even have that shared sense of equality. Actually, what strikes me more and more in reading the politics of our world today is how little we can assume that there is even a kind of basic sense of recognizing other human beings as equals. If you think about the ways in which people think about refugees, the ways in which people think about migration, the ways in which people calculate, this is a point that Judith Butler has made many times, the ways in which people disregard you know, the kind of the millions who might die in some distant war as kind of lives not worth grieving, but see them as very different from the lives around them. When we think of all those things, the idea that we do actually have that kind of basic sense of shared equality seems to me that's a hugely over-optimistic picture of the world that we live in. So again, I'm talking partly about a shift in myself. I think at one point I kind of thought, well, we've got that far to this sense of, well, in principle, we're all, you know, of equal significance. But what we so profoundly disagree about is what that means substantively in terms of how we are going to organize the social and economic and gender structures of our societies, right? So, and now I'm in a more pessimistic mode as regards that, because I do not think that we can even take for granted what at one stage in my life I thought of as just a kind of basic sense of equality. So that wasn't particularly your question, but your question kind of just sort of provoked that thought.
Esto ya la dije. Pensando en las dimensiones de la representación política de Pitkin, formal, descriptiva, simbólica y sustantiva, ¿considera que podemos pensar la igualdad de género como igualdad sustantiva?
Okay, so right, so this is an interesting moment to be asking that question, because of course one of the things that happened in the American midterm elections was not just that the Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives, but that American politics, which has been absolutely disgraceful in relation to the political representation of women, still is pretty disgraceful, but has kind of moved into a somewhat different mode in the sense of the sort of, I mean, I think 100 women, and indeed women who represent a kind of a diversity within the kind of the composition of the United States that have now been elected to the House of Representatives. So substantively, does that mean that there is increased political representation of women? So there are more women there. And some of those women, quite a lot of those women, stood for election, not just as Republicans or Democrats, but particularly among the Democrats. Many of them stood for election specifically with an idea that they wanted to do, they saw themselves as able to represent women, not just representing their political party. So did carry with them a kind of, in a sense, a promise that they were going to substantively represent women, not just, you know, descriptively, you know, there are more women in the House of Representatives. But in a sense, that's, that, like so many of these issues, is a question of politics, of what will actually emerge in terms of whether that shift in the proportion, you know, which has also been part of recent history in Mexico as well, whether that shift in the proportion of women who you know, who are there, you know, to represent us, whether that substantially or substantively means that they represent concerns about our gender structures that have not previously been addressed within politics. That depends on political choices that people make, and it depends on pressures and lobbying that is put on people as to whether or not they deliver on those promises. So there's no kind of guaranteed connection between the kind of the election of a higher proportion of women and the substantive representation of the concerns that I imagine we all share about the nature of the gender order of our societies and the things that need to change in there. But there's certainly a good deal more hope of some kind of shift in the substance when you begin to approximate something a bit closer to parity, which actually, of course, the United States doesn't approximate, but you know, it's kind of, yeah.
Then we have two more. En México, cada vez se habla más de igualdad de género como equivalente a representación proporcional de hombres y mujeres en ese esquema binario. Y en la medida en que hay más mujeres en los espacios públicos, como la política y la universidad, se empieza a afirmar que avanzamos hacia una sociedad igualitaria. Sin embargo, preocupan dos ausencias en esta noción de igualdad. Uno, las personas sexodisidentes que nunca forman parte de la cuenta que suma 100%. Y por otra, la calidad de vida y el peso de la voz de las mujeres en tales espacios públicos donde están presentes. ¿Qué nos puede decir sobre esto?
Okay. So that, I mean, that of course leads on from the previous question as well about descriptive and substantive representation. So, first of all, let's bear in mind that equality means, to my mind, 50-50, and we are nowhere near, absolutely nowhere near anything like that in our political systems, in our universities, in our, we're nowhere near it, right? But still, the question that's been posed is an important question. So first of all, the question about sexual dissidence. It seems to me it's actually not just a question about sexual dissidence, but the question is, given what in any context where people have been thinking about gender issues and reading gender theory and producing gender theory, a notion that we all know is that to talk of women is a pretty problematic simplification. That it's not just that that there are the whole kind of question of intersectionality, which includes our positioning in relation to our sexuality, right? So it includes sexual dissidence, but it also includes questions about our social class, it includes questions about our ethnicity, questions about our religion, questions about our political beliefs. All of these things mean that simply to take X number of women now powerful in the universities or now powerful in the parliaments as somehow of itself guaranteeing that something we might call women's concerns or women's interests are being represented is deeply problematic. The plus, I would say, is that precisely because there has been so much political debate about this and theoretical discussion about this, it seems to me that there is much greater awareness of this in the including in the selection of candidates to represent us in political or other spaces, so that it's very rare these days for people to think that you're simply looking for someone who's a woman without also thinking, well, are there particular categories that are being underrepresented here? Do we have lesbian women? Do we have trans women? Do we have indigenous women? All of these things are actually now discussed much more fully and practiced in terms of the ways in which, say, candidates for political election are selected. So I absolutely agree that simply increasing the numbers doesn't of itself ensure that all of the different categories and concerns are suddenly represented. But I also think that we can draw on now, some decades of both activism and theorizing around this, which mean that there is much, much more awareness about it. Thanks to bodies like the Centre. On the second question, which I take to be about how, in a sense, the norms of organizations continue to reproduce certain kinds of ways of acting, practicing, behaving, that it is very difficult to change just by entering into an organization. Yes, this is a really, really major problem, and indeed one that I think probably each of us has individual experience of kind of, you know, finding yourself in a situation where, you know, you've come with great ideas about how you're going to change things, but actually the norms of the institution that you're in, you know, whether it's a committee or a parliament or a, you know, a school or, you know, whatever, the norms have enormous power in simply regulating what it seems possible to argue for, how you should argue for it, norms of kind of politeness to one's fellow members, which mean there are certain sorts of things you don't do. This is something that is almost as important in blocking social change as simply the numbers, right? So yes, a big challenge there as well.
Y la última pregunta fue formulada en inglés. La voy a leer en inglés para no perderme la traducción, y quienes tienen su aparato traductor, por favor sigan al traductor. Dice: I guess the first two worries can be stated of several concepts: equality, freedom, reason, inclusive language, and even oppression. Besides, the history of those concepts' use includes important moments of liberation. Think of the use of equality in the civil rights movement. In order to address the third worry, we need to do some philosophical work on what equality means, on what is the ideal we are pursuing with regards to it.
Okay, so I don't at all disagree about the kind of the ways in which these ideas, arising though they did, sort of in all kinds of what I described as kind of tainted circumstances, have inspired movements. All through history, they've inspired movements, that people have taken them and put them in a different context, and they've read something into them that was very different from what the people who originally came up with the ideas actually had in mind. And that's been a hugely important part of the ways in which people have changed their world. So I would never want to represent the kinds of criticisms or concerns that I'm kind of outlining here are in no way intended to suggest that that there isn't a kind of, you know, a huge liberational potential depending on what people themselves inject into these ideals. But again, it comes back to the idea of transformation. It's not just taking them as they are and then saying, include me as well. It's something that's a bit more transformative. I take the second part of the question, though, as simply a disagreement with what I'm saying, as kind of saying we do have to do that philosophical work which enables us to refine our ideas about what this goal of equality that we're working towards is. And you know, as someone who's only relatively recently changed her position on this, I'm kind of, you know, vulnerable to, you know, changing it again. You know, but you know, that's the life of ideas. You keep thinking and so on. But I do think that it's. I am pretty convinced that that the philosophical work will be much better advanced by starting from the focus on inequality than starting from the focus on equality. There is philosophical work to be done, unquestionably, but I think I've become convinced that, what was that phrase that you used about, you know, exploring through what is not, being a very good way to develop this philosophical work.
Okay, esas han sido todas las preguntas. Do you want to put the thingy? Bueno, si no hay más preguntas por parte de la audiencia, quisiera agradecerte, Anne, enormemente por tu trabajo, por venir a conversar con nosotras, por la paciencia de contestar todas esas preguntas una a una, y pedirle al público que nos acompañen en el resto del coloquio. los siguientes 2 días. Los programas están disponibles. Agradecerles que hayan venido y pedirles que me acompañen en agradecerle a Ann que nos haya acompañado esta ocasión. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. I thought it might be. So we can discuss that more on Friday.
I'm sorry, I was trying to decipher it.
No, don't worry. I didn't know we were supposed to write it in Spanish. We need to write a question.
Yes.
It's fine, but then there was a word, several. I didn't know what it was. And then until I figure it out,
Yeah, handwriting. You realize looking at these how, with the computers, our handwriting has become so bad. What was this? Yeah.
So is everything after?
Yes. I'll just do a kind of just a sort of 20 minutes on just perhaps putting the chapter in the context of the book as a whole. Would that be useful? Do you think? Yeah. Or whatever.
I mean, this would be pretty much more a seminar rather than a.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. What about 20 people maybe? Yeah. Something like that, yes. Yeah, no, that'd be great. That'd be great. And it's okay to do it in English? Yeah, everyone will be able to. Great.
But perhaps I have to talk to Maris for your transportation from the hotel.
So Amneris is coming with me, so she will arrange for me to get there. I think the plans after the seminar are a bit undeveloped. But getting there is definitely sorted. Yeah,
we can do whatever we want.
Yeah, we can maybe have some lunch.
Yeah,
that'd be good. Yeah.
Your call will be disconnected.
Se desconectará la llamada.